From the inner sense of time comes the ancient poet's rhyme, bringing us the master key to open up the mystery. From the depth of time and space, we arrive in quiet grace, finding what is meant to be as we explore the mystery, pouring forth from days gone by. We can hear the poet sigh from the depth of ecstasy, moving into mystery. Hello and welcome again to Creative Connections. I'm your host, Gary Blanchard, and today my guest is author Kathy Sherbrooke.
Sherbrooke, yep.
And she has a new book called Leaving Coy's Hill.
That's right.
And that is a novel about the life of Lucy Stone.
That's correct.
What drew you to Lucy Stone?
Well, this may sound counterintuitive. What drew me to her was that I had never heard of her before. And when I stumbled upon a statue of her that exists in Boston and read just the smallest tidbits about her, including that she was the first woman in Massachusetts to earn a college degree, first woman to speak out on women's rights, I was really shocked that I didn't know about her. And you know, in this part of Massachusetts, her name is probably pretty common, but even in Boston, had never heard of her. And I continue to run across most people who discover the book and who I talk to had never heard of her before, which is incredible.
It really is. In reading the book, she really had an amazing life.
Yeah.
What are the challenges of writing a first-person story about someone who actually existed?
Yeah. It's a really good question. I very much wanted to write it in first person because I wanted the reader to feel really close to her, and I wanted to imagine what it might be like to be her. So we're talking about somebody born in 1818 who chose to speak in public at a time when it was considered absolutely scandalous for women to do that. So that took an extraordinary amount of courage and confidence, and you know, she did it because she at first wanted to speak out against abolition and then eventually women's rights. So this strong conviction that she had and her need to do that. So I was fascinated by what it takes for a person to be able to do that. And so I really wanted to jump into her skin to do that. But that also, you know, I felt this great responsibility to try and get it right. So that caused me to do a lot of research and feel like I could really understand her. You know, even though she's a real person who existed, I had to create her character. And so I had to feel like I really could understand who she was.
Yeah, so you used a lot of different sources. There was a lot of reading that went into it, and
Yes.
I would imagine a lot of note-taking as well.
Yes, for sure. And a lot of scribbling in the margins and highlighting things that I just thought were extraordinary facts about her life, or moments that were almost just, you know, mentioned briefly, very briefly in some of these books, but I thought, wow, what an incredible moment that might be. Like, as you may remember, there's a scene that opens the book where her cousin has just been married, and her cousin's husband basically sells her beloved horse out from under her, because that's what a husband could do back then. The horse was suddenly his property and he sold it. And so that's one of those things that was maybe a sentence in a book, and I thought, wow, what an extraordinary moment that would be for someone to go through that, and then for Lucy to see her beloved cousin experience that and then have this very visceral sense of the challenges that women face. So.
In reading your book, you know, what I'm struck by is that there are so many characters who are peripheral.
Yeah.
You know, little known names like Ralph Waldo Emerson,
Right.
Henry David Thoreau,
Yeah.
and, you know, certainly Susan B. Anthony,
Right.
Elizabeth Cady Stanton. But Coy's Hill really is kind of a major character
Yes.
in the book as well.
That's right. That's right. Lucy loved her childhood. She adored where she grew up, and she felt very close to the land there. You know, she was really an environmentalist through her life, and because of, I think it came from her love of the trees. There was an orchard on the property, and she loved that, and her family worked the land, and she understood the power of that. And she never really left that behind. Her whole life, she was really drawn to, she had a real appreciation for outdoor spaces, and trees in particular, I think, were something that really impacted her. So I very much wanted to make that an important part of the book.
You know, and it's interesting because her family plays a role, but you almost get the feeling from the book that the land was every bit as important to her as the family was, and maybe a little more, because the family was not always that supportive
Right, true,
of what she was doing,
true.
whereas the land was always there for her.
Yeah, yeah. And I think too, it's this, obviously she grew up in a very different time, but even when I was a kid, pre-internet, right? You hear parents talk about this all the time, but all you had was the spaces around you. And so I liked imagining her, in climbing the trees and in climbing the rocks of Coy's Hill. Like, that's when we do our imagining as kids about what we might do in the world and the roles that we might play and all that kind of playtime. And she did a lot of that with her older brothers and sisters. I think that's really formative for a lot of kids, and certainly was for her. Yeah.
So in putting the book together, did you find that there were certain events that were sort of like pivotal that became kind of major ideas to explore?
Yes, for certain. The way I really started writing the book was, as I mentioned, as I was researching and would find scenes like the horse being sold or facts like that I thought might be good scenes, I had a stack of them. So I'd started to just write those scenes to see which ones worked, which ones maybe didn't, which ones I felt really expressed something important about the book, and then had to start to look at them and figure out, okay, based on the arc of the story I wanted to tell, which ones fit, which ones were really engaging, which ones showed something that was important either about her or a decision she was making or somebody else that ended up being really important in her life. Unfortunately, there are a lot that didn't fit, which is always sad as a writer, because there are a lot of scenes that I love. There was way more about her life than I could possibly fit in. But it started to become clear to me key moments that were absolutely pivotal for her.
Okay.
Yeah.
What really interested me is that the book starts out by her giving a speech.
Yeah.
And then after the speech, she's talking to her daughter.
Right.
And she starts telling her daughter about her life.
Right.
And I thought that was such a wonderful way into the story. How did you capture her voice?
Yeah. Well, she made her career as a master orator. So it's funny, we use the word voice in writing. A character's voice is something you have to do for every character, but for Lucy in particular, she really made her living and her impact on the world through her words and actually finding her voice. So I relied, for that I relied a lot on her letters. I was really fortunate to be able to access troves of letters both that were written to her, but more importantly, ones that she had written. And so it really helped me understand how she thought and felt, but also how she put words together.
Exactly, because you have to make, I'm sure, a lot of assumptions.
Yes.
But it must have been very helpful to at least know how she used words.
Yes, definitely.
And feel like you were capturing her character.
Right.
And the way that she would speak.
Yes, for certain.
So, just before you came here, you were doing a book talk.
Yes.
And one of the questions that people asked was, why is it that Lucy Stone is not as well known as perhaps Susan B. Anthony?
Yes, indeed. Especially considering the just outsized impact she had on women's rights. It is shocking that she is not as well known, as much of a household name or more than some of these others. And in my view, the main reason is because she had a significant falling out with Susan B. Anthony over the 15th Amendment. So this is in 1869, after they've been working together for decades. Fierce colleagues, really close friends, but they disagreed on whether or not to support the 15th Amendment, which was written to give black men the vote before women. And the American Equal Rights Association was really hoping that the Women's Coalition would have a unified point of view on that and support it. And Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton did not want to support it. And Lucy Stone very publicly broke with them. And I think Susan B. Anthony never forgave her for that. And so the women's movement split in two, and Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton really went on to own the narrative. They literally wrote the history of women's suffrage, and like so much in any country's history, but certainly ours, the folks who own the narrative get to tell that story. So
right.
They told the story the way they wanted to, and Lucy got more or less left out of that story.
Which is, really a shame, and particularly when you realize how closely allied they had been
right.
before that split.
Right, for sure. I mean, Lucy Stone and Susan B. Anthony, I think of them as two of the first true career women. All women worked, whether that was in the home or in factories or taking on sewing projects, whatever it was, but to have a career that you felt truly passionate about and dedicated your life to. And so they were really, they supported each other in that life and what it took to run that life and the sacrifices that they had to make. So they were extraordinarily close. So seeing them split, I'm sure it was really emotionally challenging on both of them. I know it was for Lucy for sure.
Yeah. And there is a scene towards the end of the book where Susan B. Anthony comes to see Lucy Stone as she is basically dying. Right. How much of that is kind of conjecture and how much of that is known? Yeah.
So as I mentioned, after this falling out, the women's movement split into two organizations. Lucy's daughter actually, this isn't in the book, but she actually negotiated a remerger between the two organizations close to the end of Lucy's life, not as close as that conversation is. So they did see each other, and they did agree in sort of a prickly way to merge. That section of time isn't in the book, but I very much, because it's such an important storyline in the book, I very much wanted to imagine, even if they didn't have that conversation together, what they would have wanted to say to each other. And I think my goal was to have it as an honest conversation, not to wrap anything up in a tidy bow. Yeah. Because I think they were both stubborn women who, saw it the way that they saw it, but cared enough about each other to at least respect each other for their differences.
Yeah. And, I think that's an important lesson for our time. That, you can still respect other people despite differences of opinion.
Right. Right. Shocking idea.
Yeah, shocking. Who would have thought
so
of
true.
something like that?
I know.
So this is your third published book.
Correct. Yes.
And your first one was a memoir of your parents.
Yes. I call it a family memoir. Yeah. My parents had a classic turbulent love affair, and I always wanted to, piece together the whole story and have it as a family record. So that was my first endeavor.
Okay, and that one you were familiar with the characters.
Right.
And, it was recent enough history that, you had a lot of ability to gather that information. Your second book is more a contemporary fiction.
Contemporary fiction. So it is set in Ecuador. So the setting and the experiences which involve the book is about 3 women who go to Ecuador to see if shaman can cure one of them from cancer, and so they experience a lot of shamanic rituals. So those rituals were things that I experienced for different reasons, but I went on a trip to Ecuador, so I thought it struck me as a wonderful setting in an unusual place to then set a fully fictional story. So unlike my parents' story, totally fictional characters, completely fictional plot, but I set it into this set of experiences that I had recently been through, which made it an interesting sort of combination.
Yeah. So 3 very different,
really different
books. Probably a difficult question to answer, but which was the hardest to write?
I would say the second one, the contemporary novel that I just described, is the hardest. It's funny because when I was writing my parents' story, it was slightly frustrating because it was true. It was memoir, so I wasn't at liberty to fill in blanks. I wasn't at liberty to make up conversations. I had to rely on the facts as I knew them, and couldn't really insert my own conjecture. So I thought in going to fiction where I could do anything, sky's the limit, any character can do anything. That also is full of challenge because it's limitless. You have unending choices. So, oh my gosh, what think of all the things that I'm not thinking of. And also being my first novel, that was really, it took a long time for me to get my head around learning how to do that. So Leaving Coy's Hill is interesting because it's sort of an interesting combination between the two, which is that I had facts, but I was also giving myself fictional license to fill in the blanks of things that weren't there. So I had some guardrails, if you will.
Right, sure,
of, things I decided I wasn't gonna make up any major plot point that didn't actually happen to Lucy.
Right.
But I did have to, all the dialogue was, as an example, was something that I had to create. So I liked that combination of having a certain amount of structure, but then having license to color in places that needed to be colored in.
Yeah. I've often heard writers say about fiction that they are writing and suddenly characters do things they didn't expect.
Yes.
Did you experience that?
Yes, I definitely experienced that. It's kind of incredible. As I said, since I didn't fully make up any plot points, I knew kind of on a map, if you will, what Lucy's life was going to look like. But in really understanding her intentions behind some of the decisions she made, and sitting and trying to understand, what was she afraid of, what made her happy, what made her sad, that I really had to kind of just sit with and make sure it made sense to me. And through that process, there were definitely moments where I would say, oh, now I get it. I was missing this whole thing before, I completely misunderstood why she made this choice, and now I understand why she made that choice. So,
okay.
So it's fun. And then the other thing I would say that I have discovered through both of my novels is, and my writing friends say the same thing, in describing a scene or a moment, there are details that you put in that you don't know why. Whether that's a certain, it could be the way someone describes a tree or an object in the room, and you don't know why it's there. And then you discover 6 chapters later why it was there, because it suddenly takes on importance.
Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah, it's really
that's one I've not heard before.
Yeah, it happens a lot. It's fascinating.
Yeah. So what drew you to writing?
Reading. So as a kid, I thought books were magic. I really did. It's sort of, I disappeared into books. I loved reading. I felt like even through my whole formal education that I always learned the most from fiction, because pure history, as an example, the facts and the figures just weren't that interesting, and I'd immediately forget them. And as soon as they were attached to a person, who was striving to do something or was disappointed by something, then it really had an impact on me. So I always wanted to write. It took me a long time to come to it, though, because it sounds crazy, but it was so magical to me that I thought it was some gift that either you had or you didn't. And if no one came down with sort of a creative tiara and tapped me and said, you have it, that I guess it was for other people to do.
And I think that's one thing that really, one reason I like doing this show is that I think we all have the ability to be creative. Maybe each of us in different ways, but we're sort of given the idea that it's something that other people do.
Right, absolutely. And it's really a craft, like any other craft that can be learned. And, reading is one of the best ways to learn it, and then practicing it like any other craft. And so it took me a long time to understand that and give myself the chance to try.
What was it like getting that first book that you wrote in your hands?
Oh, unbelievable. It's just a feeling like no other. Just this notion of, it just makes it real, to hold it in your hands and then see it on a bookshelf too. And I remember when my first novel came out, and I took my son to the local bookstore, and he was probably 12 at the time, if I'm getting the timing right. And I said, I hear it's on the shelf, come with me. And even though he'd been hearing about this book for years, seeing it on this shelf, even he said, oh my God, Mom, it's real. It's as if it doesn't exist until it's, bound and on a bookstore shelf. So it's a really incredible feeling.
That's great.
Yeah.
So what's next in?
So I do have another novel in progress. It is has historical time periods, but it is not based this time on one individual who was a real person. So it takes place both in 1940s Hollywood and 1970s surrounding Broadway in New York. So different again.
So even more research to even more times and places.
Yes, exactly.
So it's interesting because for your second book, you spent time in Ecuador.
Right.
When you were doing the Lucy Stone book, did you go out and look at the homestead?
I did. And I stopped by again on my way here in between. So I had written most of the manuscript before I actually visited, which was interesting. I was reflecting on that today as I was there, because I had read so much about it. So I had an envisioning in my own head that I wrote. And this also goes to one of the creative things I was talking about before. So you may remember in the book that she mentions several times a stream on her property and playing in it as a kid, and then it comes back up at the end of the book. So I was walking the property, so this was 3 years ago after I'd finished the manuscript, the first draft, and I'm walking and I'm thinking to myself, I feel like there should be a stream. Did I make that up when I was writing, or is there really a stream? I hope there's a stream. And I kept walking, I'll never forget it, and all of a sudden I heard it. And I walked a little further, and I was like, there it is there. And I still am not sure if it was described as having a stream in something else that I wrote, or if I just put one there. I'm not sure. But the minute it was almost like a religious experience, seeing the stream and saying, oh, it is there. I knew there had to be a stream here, which is really interesting.
Yeah, it is interesting sometimes. You can usually tell when a person has picked a place off the map,
Yeah.
having no clue
Right.
what the place is like.
Right, exactly.
And when they've actually been there.
Yes, yeah, yeah.
So if people want to get Leaving Coy's Hill.
Yes, and this is what it looks
Yeah,
like.
yeah,
in case
this is
anyone hasn't
the book cover.
seen it before. That's the book cover. And it's essentially available anywhere books are sold. So bookstores, Amazon, Kindle, the audiobook is available. And you can also, if you want to read more about it, or there's a discussion guide, I do have a website, which is K.A. Sherbrooke, with an E on the end, the author name, kasherbrooke.com. So there's a little bit more about the background and some pictures and ways to get in touch with me too, if anyone would like me to come to a book group as an example. I love Zoom book groups, that's fun.
As I say, you just did a talk for the East Brookfield Historical Society.
Yes, I did.
And I recommend, if you get a chance to hear her talk about the book, to go out and do it. And I want to thank you all again for tuning in to Creative Connections. Thank you, Catherine, for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And I will see you all the next time on Creative Connections. Okay. All right.
All right. Well done.
From the inner sense of time comes the ancient poet's rhyme, bringing us the master key to open up the mystery. From the depth of time and space, we arrive in quiet grace, finding what is meant to be as we explore the mystery, pouring forth from days gone by. We can hear the poet sigh from the depth of ecstasy, moving into mystery.